Should you get an Intel or AMD CPU in your next gaming laptop? I've compared Intel's 275HX against AMD's 9955HX in 29 games, applications, thermals, power draw, and way more to find out. To be clear, this is not about the 9955HX 3D with 3D V-cache, but those comparisons are coming very soon, so get subscribed. Intel's Core Ultra 9 275HX processor has 24 cores, with 8 of them being higher performing P cores and 16 being lower powered E cores. Intel also removed hyperthreading this generation, so the 24 cores have 24 threads. Meanwhile, AMD's Ryzen 9 9955HX has 16 cores and 32 threads, so Intel technically has more cores in total, but AMD's are more similar to Intel's fewer, more powerful P cores. AMD's chip has 78% more level 3 cache compared to Intel, but Intel has 150% more level 2 cache than AMD. Both processors have a 5.4 GHz max boost clock and a 55W TDP on the spec sheet, but they can both use much more power than this, as you'll see. Intel also supports faster DDR5 6400 memory at stock, while AMD runs at DDR5 5600 by default. I've used the exact same kit of DDR5 5600 memory in both laptops for a fair comparison. Yeah, I could have used faster memory in the Intel laptop, which would still be a fair comparison, as that's just a benefit of the Intel platform. But my goal here was to focus on the difference between these two processors, without other factors being responsible for the changes. And there are still plenty of Intel 275HX laptops that ship with DDR5 5600 memory. But don't worry, I will compare the RAM differences in a future video, so get subscribed for that. Now, I'm using XMG's Neo 16 laptop to do this testing, as both laptops have the same full-powered RTX 5090 laptop GPU, same drivers, Windows updates, game updates, same air cooling, same battery, same everything, so this comparison is as fair as it gets. Both of these laptops allow us to adjust the power limit of the CPU through the control center software, and more power equals more performance, but also more heat. This graph shows the Cinebench multi-core score for both processors at different power levels, with AMD in red and Intel in blue. When running between 15 and 85 watts of power, Intel was performing better, but then for some reason, Intel performance dips down between 85 and 120 watts. That's quite weird, and if I hadn't seen similar results reported by others, I'd think I'd done something wrong, but that's how it seems to be in this test. This means AMD is outperforming Intel in this test between 90 and 150 watts of power. The software doesn't let the AMD laptop use more than 160 watts of power, while Intel goes higher. But after monitoring performance in a number of different apps, I found both laptops would usually thermal throttle around the 155 watt mark. So all applications have been tested at both 80 watts and 150 watts, where 80 watts is meant to represent a low performance mode, while 150 watts shows max performance you'd likely see from most laptops. Intel was about 5% better in terms of single core score, or almost 4% faster in multi-core at 150 watts. The Intel laptop was also running cooler with both at 150 watts. So not only was it providing better performance in this test, it's doing it while remaining cooler too. That said, AMD was cooler with both running at 80 watts and scoring similarly in multi-core. The AMD laptop was drawing more power at the wall than the Intel laptop, whether we're limiting the processors to an 80 or 150 watt TDP. This would also include other things like the integrated graphics, power to the screen, SSDs, and so on. But those key components are all the same, except of course the CPUs. This puts Intel ahead from an efficiency perspective. Basically, Intel was using less power and performing the same at 80 watts, and performing better at 150 watts, which means a higher performance per watt value. The AMD chip was reaching higher clock speeds, which I suspect is because the Intel chip has more cores to spread its power over with all those lower powered E cores. That's just one workload though. Other rendering workloads like Blender, V-Ray, or Corona Renderer were all performing better on AMD, regardless of power limit. So these clearly prefer AMD's 16 big cores over Intel's 8 big cores plus 16 small cores. Content creator workloads were all scoring better with AMD too, whether we're talking about DaVinci Resolve, Adobe Premiere, or Adobe Photoshop. Though only Photoshop saw a big difference between Intel and AMD. The others were quite close. Video encoding with Handbrake was a fair bit faster with AMD too. These results are in seconds rather than a score, so lower is better now. But Intel had a massive lead when it came to MATLAB. This workload doesn't seem to care too much about extra power, but if you use this app a lot, Intel is the way to go. And it was also the biggest win for Intel out of all apps tested. AES encryption with OpenSSL was significantly better with AMD. Again, the differences between 80 and 150 watt power limits was basically nothing, as these workloads would depend more on the implementation of hardware acceleration for AES and I. AMD was around 35% faster in decompression with 7-zip, and around 14% faster when it came to compression. Compiling LLVM was much faster with AMD too, with AMD completing the task in about 27% less time than Intel at both power levels. Geekbench claims to test realistic workloads, but the multi-core results are closer to what we saw in Cinebench earlier than the real-world apps we've just gone through. Though interestingly, AMD was slightly ahead in single-core here. On average, out of these specific tests, AMD's Ryzen 9 9955HX was 10% faster than Intel's Core Ultra 9 275HX, with both power limited to 80 watts. Intel only really had a clear win when it came to MATLAB, and some minor gains in synthetic tests like Cinebench and Geekbench. But the majority of real-world workloads were better on AMD. The gap gets slightly larger in favor of AMD, with both power limited to 150 watts. AMD was 12% faster now, with its biggest wins coming from OpenSSL AES encryption and 7-zip decompression. Again, this difference only applies to these specific workloads I've chosen to test. So AMD crushes in terms of performance in a bunch of real-world workloads. But what about gaming? I've tested 29 games on both laptops at 1080p, 1440p, and even 4K just to demonstrate how little CPU choice actually matters at higher resolutions. And there were not any CPU power limits in place for this testing, which is how you would actually run a game on these things. So they're both just going to be performing as best as they can. Let's start out with The Last of Us Part 2. At 1080p, Intel was reaching a 13% higher average frame rate compared to AMD, but then there's no practical difference at 1440p or 4K, as higher resolutions are typically more GPU bound, so the CPU difference matters less. Of course, that's not always the case. In Counter-Strike 2, AMD had a noticeable lead at all three resolutions, but if we're being real, most people wouldn't notice the 6% higher average FPS at 1080p, especially given the dips in performance shown by the 1% lows are so similar. Rainbow Six Siege was 11% faster on AMD at 1080p and 5% faster at 1440p, and then there's no real difference between Intel and AMD at 4K. Average FPS in Fortnite was mixed depending on the resolution, but Intel had higher 1% low results, and that increased stability would matter more if you're playing competitively. PUBG was around 6% faster on AMD at 1080p and 1440p, and then like most games, almost no change at 4K. But some games like Spider-Man 2 seem to like Intel more. Intel was almost 11% faster at 1080p high settings, but then just 3% faster at 1440p, with no difference at 4K. Stalker 2 also preferred Intel, where it was 8% faster at 1080p, 5% faster at 1440p, and again, no real difference at 4K. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a strange outlier, and was one of the best performing games on AMD, even at 4K. Based on all the testing I've done with RTX 5090 laptops over the last few months, I believe there's some sort of issue or bug with RTX 50 series plus Intel CPUs in this game, which makes AMD look much better. The Rift Breaker was included as a real-time strategy game, and with the CPU benchmark, AMD was always performing better, where it had the biggest 13% lead over Intel at 1080p out of all 29 games tested. Civ 6 turn time was tested with the game's AI benchmark, so we're looking at how long it takes a turn to complete here rather than FPS, which means lower numbers are better. The resolution also doesn't matter for this test, but I tested all three for completeness, and Intel was always slightly faster. Instead of individually talking through the rest of the 19 games tested, I'll just quickly skip through the results on screen now, as for the most part, many of them have smaller differences than what we've already looked at, so feel free to pause the video if you want a closer look at any of the other games tested. I think it's important to test a wide selection of games so that we can get an accurate picture of their average performance differences to make the fairest possible conclusion. In other words, more data equals more better. Let's look at those average differences next. On average, over all 25 games tested, at 1080p, AMD's Ryzen 9 9955HX was just 1.5% faster when compared to Intel's Core Ultra 9 275HX. 1080p is where we would expect the biggest difference out of the 3 resolutions tested, but once we average up all the games tested, there's really not that much difference between them. Some games had pretty big swings towards AMD or Intel, but generally speaking, AMD was only a little better. But what about 1% low results? These show the dips in performance and represent how stable gameplay is. There are fewer games because not all of them tested provided 1% low data, but in these 26 games, AMD was almost 1% slower than Intel, so Intel was generally a little better here. But again, it's just not enough to really matter if you average a large selection of games. Stepping up to 1440p, and the 9955HX was now just 1.2% faster than the 275HX in average FPS, which again is almost nothing, especially if we ignore the weird Red Dead Redemption 2 result. This resolution is the closest to what you'd probably be running these games at, as laptops with these chips generally come with QHD+ screens. The difference is even smaller when it comes to the 1% lows. Honestly, I was expecting to see bigger differences between the two here rather than smaller, but here we are. If you're connecting a 4K screen, because let's face it, RTX 5090 laptops like these can definitely run games at 4K, well, there's an even smaller difference between the two in average frame rate. AMD was just 0.4% faster than Intel here on average. And if we ignore the weirdness going on in Red Dead Redemption 2, then AMD is just 0.1% ahead. So basically, it doesn't really matter which CPU you pick at 4K, unless maybe you're playing esports titles at 4K and want a slight edge. The difference is equally as small when looking at 1% lows. Baldur's Gate 3 was a bit of an outlier, favoring Intel for its 1% lows. But apart from that, nothing really stands out here as being all that different. Here's how frame rates look if we instead take the average of all games at all resolutions. I think this better allows us to visually see the overall difference in a quick and easy summary, and just how small that difference really is, especially as the resolutions get higher. Intel had a big win when it came to performance on integrated graphics, reaching more than double the average FPS compared to AMD in Cyberpunk 2077 at 720p medium settings. AMD does have better integrated graphics options in their other processors, just not in their higher-end HX stuff, which I think makes sense as you'd only pair these processors with powerful discrete graphics. Nevertheless, if for some reason you do care about iGPU gaming, Intel wins massively here. The difference in battery life was massive, despite both laptops having the same sized battery, so we can clearly tell that the integrated graphics in the Intel laptop are more power efficient. So what sort of a price difference are we talking about between Intel and AMD? Prices will of course change over time, so check the links below the video for updates and to see if there are current sales. Because if gaming laptops with either of these processors have a good sale, we'll be sure to add them to our gaminglaptop.deals website. We update that every day to include all of the best sales, so make sure that you check it out regularly to save money on your next gaming laptop with that link below. At the time of recording in mid-July, in the US, I can only find this one MSI laptop on Best Buy with both CPUs, and it's $2,700 for the 9955HX, but with lower tier 5070 Ti graphics. The Intel version, on the other hand, costs $100 more, but this laptop also has double the RAM, so some of that price difference would come from there. But even if they were the same price, AMD still performs a little better for the money. Over in Germany, where my XMG laptops came from, for the exact configurations I've tested, we're looking at €4,089 for AMD's 9955HX with 5090, or an extra €60 for Intel's 275HX, which translates to just 1.5% more money for Intel at these higher prices. AMD's 9955HX offers slightly better value from a cost per frame perspective. That is, how much you have to spend to get 1 FPS of performance. And this makes sense, because not only was AMD providing slightly more FPS on average in the game tests, but it's slightly cheaper too. But if we're being realistic, if you're spending this much money on a laptop, you're just gonna buy whatever's best. And it just so happens that in most cases, the AMD processor ends up performing better than the Intel processor. So you might as well save a little money and go with AMD, unless there are some specific games or workloads that do work better with Intel, like like, say, MATLAB or The Last of Us Part 2, or if you care about integrated graphics performance, or better battery life, or better power efficiency, or slightly cooler temps when under max load. Ultimately, you can't go too wrong with either CPU. It doesn't really matter which one you pick, but the fact is, Intel's 275HX is available in more laptops. So if there's a model you want that's Intel only, don't worry about it, it'll still perform great. It's unfortunate that some brands like Asus are only pairing AMD processors with lower tier graphics, like the Asus Strix G16. If you want it with an AMD processor, then it maxes out at 5070 Ti graphics. You're forced into buying the Intel model if you want the 5080 or 5090 graphics. And GPU selection will make far more of a difference in games compared to your choice of CPU. So check out this one next to find out if the 5090 I've tested here is worth the extra cash. You might be better off saving the money and going for the 5080 instead. So I'll see you in that one next to find out.